right is Brooke Lehman. We'll start off with Janet, and then come to me, and then follow on down the line. So,
great.
Janet Redman.
Thank you. Right, so as Michael mentioned, I work at the Institute for Policy Studies. We're a progressive think tank in Washington, D.C. that looks at issues of peace, justice, and the environment. We're very much interested in connecting activism, grassroots politics with politics kind of on the inside in Washington, D.C. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is how we've been approaching climate justice through the lens of finance. So just to start out with, today is the International Day of Climate Action. Around the world, there's activities happening in New York City and Washington, D.C., all over the U.S., and all over the world, in fact. Thank you. Thanks. It's not going to actually help my volume, so I'll speak louder. But I wanted to give you, before folks jump into some deeper analysis of climate justice, a sense of what the overall politics are of what we're talking about right now. And as probably most of you know, if you've picked up a newspaper in the past 6 months, we're approaching a really big deal in the global arena around climate change policy. And that, of course, is moving to Copenhagen in December, where 192 country delegations are going to get together and try to pound out a climate deal. Just to kind of get into a couple of technicalities around that, probably most of you are familiar with the Kyoto Protocol, and that was a treaty that was formed in 1997 to limit greenhouse gases from developed countries. So just an aside, I'm going to use developed and developing countries. That's the language that's in the treaty itself. I may also throw in global south and global north, just to kind of mix it up a little bit as well, but to recognize that, of course, when I'm speaking about north and south, there are, of course, north and south within both of those different categorizations. They're not perfect. I figured this was a crowd that might matter for, but I'm just going to kind of stick to what we talk about in Washington, D.C., and in the folks that I work with in the climate justice movement. So really briefly, though, the things that are happening in Copenhagen are, one, there's a treaty, the Kyoto Protocol is actually entering a second phase. And in that second phase, they're asking governments, rich governments, to, again, commit to greenhouse gas reductions. What's also happened, of course, is that the U.S. is not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol. We didn't sign it before. We're not going to sign it again. It's not going to happen. Congress won't allow it to happen. And so what the world has done is actually said, okay, you guys find yourself to be an exception. We're not going to have that battle. You're an exception. We're going to start a whole other negotiating track where you can sign on. It won't bring down our commitments, but we'll get you on board. And while we're doing that, we'll also think about how developing countries can also be a part of the global climate policy system. So what's really on the table in this conversation is two big things. One is massive greenhouse gas reductions in the global north, and technology and financing that needs to transfer to developing countries to help them move to a low-carbon growth model and to deal with the locked-in global warming that's already happening. So those two things are, one is mitigation, that's the lingo that's used out there you may have heard, and that's the idea of getting to a lower emissions overall, and adaptation, which is recognizing the reality that even if we stopped driving cars today, we've still got about a 50-year lag time of global warming that's still locked in and happening. So just to kind of put a couple of numbers on the table, we're talking about approximately $500 billion a year that needs to be transferred from north to south. And that's probably a lowball estimate. That's the World Bank's estimate. So we're talking about a huge transfer of cash from north to south at a time when we're basically in a financial crisis and people claim that there's no money to move around. Of course, we know that that's not true. It depends on who you ask and who you are asking. So kind of moving out of the mainstream politics, that's kind of the context for climate action, which is the idea of kind of mainstream environmentalism, that something needs to happen. We've got to make something happen this year or the world is screwed. Looking at it coming from a climate justice perspective, folks are more interested in how we're going to solve this problem, not just getting to a number like 350 parts per million, which is about what this day is about today. International Day of Climate Action is about letting the world know we have to get to a certain CO2 concentration. It's not a political action day. It's not talking about how we get to 350 parts per million. And that's kind of more what the climate justice movement globally is asking. How do we deal with this problem that's a product of how countries have developed over the past 250 years? How will we move forward in that? One of the ways I think that folks have come up with in the past couple of years to really frame it in a different way is talking about climate debt. And climate debt jumps off of a concept that a bunch of movements in the global south have been working with for a long time called ecological debt. And that's the idea that basically rich countries got rich off the backs of poor countries. So climate debt uses that same kind of thought, and recognizing that we've gotten in this country, in the US, to this place today because we've used up a lot of the carbon budget in the atmosphere. So in fact, it's time for us to repay that climate debt. And there are kind of three things that means. One is, again, the North has to take responsibility for the climate debt, for the climate change that's already incurred, and that's the idea of adaptation finance. Second is just the idea that the North has used more than its fair share of this budget. We're about 20% of the population, but we've used about 75% of the space that the atmosphere can absorb carbon with. So that leaves basically the entire pie left for the world before we hit what lots of folks are calling the ecological disaster zone, unrecognizable planet Earth, basically. We've got about a quarter left. And so how are we going to split that up? And the idea is we need to make reparations in the North to pay back the space that we've taken up, more of our fair share, basically pay folks back for the food that we took out of their mouths. But then also, when we split up this last quarter of the pie, are we going to split it up in a new way that recognizes that still we're about 20% of the population, and 80% of the population is basically still working on development in a way to get to cover basic needs. So we're going to need to change the way we do development. And a lot of folks in the global south have said what that really means in repaying climate debt is reducing emissions in the North massively, but also making money available for folks like India, Bangladesh, Nicaragua, whatever, to jump past, this is called the leapfrogging, right? Leapfrogging the way that the North has developed, basically because they don't have anyone else to exploit, to grab their natural resources on the cheap from, and move to a new development paradigm that's low carbon. I need to know how I'm doing on time. I'm good? Okay.
You're going to go to 10 minutes, I feel.
Okay, give me the flag
you've
at 1
gone
minute.
7 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I guess just to really make a point, what we're talking about with the financing and the climate problem, it's not just an environmental problem, right? We all know that we're potentially in trouble. But even if you don't think that climate change is going to happen, even if you don't believe that the planet's warming, what's really at stake is a huge resource grab, probably the largest historical transfer of resources from south to north, right? If we think about right now, if we don't change the way we operate, basically what's going to happen is we're going to be sending huge amounts of atmospheric space that's now worth something, right? Because we're pricing carbon. I know other folks will talk about that. But if you start pricing carbon, 1 minute left, and all of a sudden you say that actually the North is going to continue to use a lot of this carbon and the South space is going to shrink, then you've basically made a huge transfer of resources from South to North. There's also another big piece that's coming that folks probably don't know about here unless you're really in the deep in the jargon of climate change right now. We're talking about reducing our emissions in the North on a super cheap way, and one of the ways is to buy other people's forests and say, since we bought your forest, we get to count the carbon that's locked into your trees as our carbon reduction. We'll keep pumping carbon up in the North, right? But we've saved these trees, so that counts as our reduction. What that means, of course, is the land that's, the carbon is in something. It's in the trees. The trees are sitting on someone's land. We have no sense of what that means in terms of whose land that now is. Is that the Southern government's land? Is that the indigenous community's land? Or is that now the Northern government's land who's bought the carbon that sits on the trees that sit on that piece of land? So potentially we're looking at a huge land grab also from south to north and all the resources associated with that. So just the last 30 seconds. What the climate justice movement is calling for is a repayment of this climate debt. Again, a massive transfer from north to south of resources, of financial resources, but also changing the way that transfers happen. It can't be about World Bank. It can't be about international financial institutions that put conditions on money from north to south. It has to be a new system where it's not just Southern governments that are empowered, but communities who are actually making reductions in emissions on the ground, figuring out a way to finance the relocalization of everything, right? Energy, agriculture, locking in some kind of way that money is flowing in a way that promotes democratic local control of natural and other kinds of resources. So this is the challenge that's on the plate for folks who are looking at this international play of climate action and climate justice. And I'd be interested to ask more questions, to answer questions about that and have a rich discussion about that. Thanks.
Unless there's a burning question, we'll take questions at the end. Is that okay for people? Okay, great. And I'll stand up because I can't reach the slides here. I want to pick up the conversation really on three real big points to give you some background and deep context on the extent of climate crisis, and then to really sort of wade us into what I'm thinking about is basically a thumbnail sketch of the dominant or hegemonic proposed solutions that are out there, which sort of pulls on something that David was talking about in the morning, the way in which capital comes up with new limits and then places barriers and then attempts to exceed them. And then I want to sort of briefly sketch the resistance to this hegemonic set of forces in the sort of touch on climate justice, but I know Ashley's going to get more in depth on that. So then very quickly, what's the big context? Well, two big things. Well, the climate crisis is worse than pretty much all of the forecast, and it's really grossly uneven, as we'll type in there. So the old science, which I won't spend much time on this, I put this up here because there's a sort of a thing that happens in America when you talk about this with American audiences, a sort of disbelief and all this sort of thing. But this is really the sort of the old science, nothing really new here. You've got CO2 going up, and we know there's a correlation between increasing CO2 and rising temperature. What are the sort of surprises and new realities? Well, the big one is that all this stuff is really ahead of schedule. Climate change and sort of catastrophic climate change, way ahead of schedule. How so? A couple brief examples. Sea ice extent, one sort of glimpse at this. They didn't think they would get to this sort of point, really it bottoming out until about 2100, 2150. It looks like it'll bottom out in the Arctic probably by mid-century, maybe sooner. We thought that we would see China jump past the U.S. in terms of overall emissions, not per capita, but in terms of overall emissions, the forecast was mid-century. It happened a couple of years ago. We could have we could do a whole talk on just where we thought we were going to be in terms of some of the looming problems and the sort of forecast from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and where we are now. Basically, the situation is much, much worse than we thought it would be. So what does that mean? That means that some are forecasting zero emissions overall because of these sort of problems that are coming online really, really quickly in our face. Some are saying that given the sort of unevenness of this on the planet, the zero emissions commitment is probably going to have to be -10, -20 maybe in the global north, where industrialized emissions are really, really high. That has huge implications for bills like Waxman-Markey, like Kerry Boxer, when they talk about sort of cutting by 80%. So big gaps there, maybe a 40% gap, maybe more. What does that mean in terms of thinking like 350? Well, I don't want to get too much into science because we don't really have a lot of time. But 350 is saying basically with 350 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we get 2 degrees of warming, 2 degrees C of warming. We've got people in small islands saying we need 1.5 to stay alive. We're already more or less feeling 2 degrees, and probably it's going to go higher. And people are saying, well, really that is too much. So really the extent of the problem is really uneven around the planet. You get a sense of this, and you talk to folks at IPCC. Really, we're out of time. The science to date has been too conservative because it really has missed sort of forecasting the true extent of the problem. So things are uneven. This is a sort of a crude way of looking at where the problems are. Basically, the global south in the dark colors, and the number of people affected in terms of millions. The impacts of climate change definitely on the global south. You pull Africa countries, of the 28 countries around the planet that are experiencing or subject to possible extreme risk from climate, 22 in Africa. So the extent of harm, the extent of the problem, very uneven around the globe. So that's the context, that's the sketch. Well, what are the solutions? The solutions really, and I won't go over this, this is basically a thumbnail sketch of Waxman-Markey, and you could say it's kind of an analogous thumbnail sketch of Kerry Boxer. Key components, an energy title inside of it, an efficiency title. The engine that drives this, the market engine, a cap and trade program. The gist of that, really won't go into this, but basically a market approach to dealing with the problem. We have polluters that can exchange permits and sell and buy and trade from one another in order to sort of contain the problem of growing emissions. Well, what's the brief theory here? You all have undoubtedly heard this. The idea is here we use the market because it's more efficient, it's faster, it reduces the cost that large emitters have to pay. pay attention to who's talking here. This is not sort of any Johnny-come-lately. This is a World Bank official, Ken Newcomb, who's really the sort of the godfather of this thinking at the multilateral level. Well, how fast is this stuff? Is it really going to work? When you really push the economists, they tell you that really these market approaches aren't that fast after all. They're actually a lot slower. There are a lot of problems inside of them. But we were also warned. You look at some of the market makers, market actors who are pushing this, and as they've been analyzing the largest carbon market in the European Union emissions trading scheme, they give you a sense of who's winning and who's losing. Basically, market makers, market architects, insiders, they're winning, and the costs falling, mainly to those on the margins and the poor. And then a sense that really the market approach isn't really having that much effect on climate change. Depending on whose numbers you look at, we see basically pretty much no change in European emissions, and some even argue that the emissions have gone up, but after roughly about 6 years of a market approach in Europe. So we go back to Ken Newcomb then, and just curiously, when he changes jobs, when he leaves the sort of public sector at the bank and goes to Goldman, he sort of changes his tune. When he starts his own company, of course, he has to change tune again, make a different kind of pitch. Important here to sort of track these tendencies of key capitalists as they sort of make the claim about these activities in the marketplace. The long and short of it is that, well, the trading wasn't the answer, can't be the answer, in part because of the issue of time, the issue of really dealing with the problem. And indeed, it might have been a costly mistake. We turn to folks like Katarina Stjepma, who's been looking a lot at arbitrage issues in between some of the emerging carbon markets, or some more crass assessments a few years back when this was really beginning in the UK. We really don't want to do this. And this is an important point because this is at the onset. This is a year before they turn on the European Union emissions trading scheme in 2004. Okay, so really a sense of the problems of this really before it starts. Nothing really new here. And so what are people thinking about now? On top of the problems of the market not being able to check this problem, we have the sort of looming specter of malfeasance, fraud, all the sorts of things that happen in sort of nascent markets as they come online. So then injustice, the response to it. Well, one of the reasons for a climate justice movement has a lot to do with slides like this. One can look at the global injustice in a sort of a narrower slice and looking at individual countries. And we don't have time to do that now. And problems around the globe where indeed we're seeing already a couple years ago a move to relocate people in a variety of small islands. Here are some examples from Papua New Guinea. So what's going to come tomorrow? Presumably a climate justice movement, which Ashley will give us some insights into. So yeah, thanks.
Can you give me an internet?
I think I can. Let's see.
Okay, so the question, of course, is how to mobilize people around climate justice. And what I'd like to talk about for a second is one kind of way of getting into that, and it's around the issue of carbon offsetting and the way that chains are created, link communities in various different places. Because the climate justice movement obviously is something that takes off from the environmental justice movement, which was a phenomenon in the United States over the last 20 years or so, where communities that were adversely affected by the location of toxic facilities began to mobilize and to unite within the framework of the United States and building on the civil rights movement. So what I think is happening today is that there's a movement which is leveraging onto a kind of international plane around issues of climate justice and beginning to mobilize on a kind of transnational plane. So what I'd like to take you through very quickly is one way that's likely to happen. I don't know if this is going to work, but what I wanted to do is to show you a website where some of the kind of gnawing fears that people have around climate change can be dealt with. This is a website, and there are many of them out there. Some of you may have seen them and even used them, which allow you to offset your pollution by buying credits for projects in various different parts of the world that ameliorate climate change. So the website, which I wanted to show you, allows you to plug in the place you're going. So let's say you're going with your professional group or with your family or something on a vacation in Hawaii or the Caribbean. It allows you to plug in your site of your home and the destination to which you're going, calculate the carbon credits that your trip is going to make, and then pay for some sort of offset for that. It's called Climate Care. .com, I guess.
Did it? Did it?
No, it's not.
All right. Tell me the right name.
Can you Google?
Activism.org.
All right. So it's not that important. I'm sorry. We have so little time. I should keep going anyway.
There we go. JP Morgan Climate Care?
Yeah, that's right.
They've recently been bought.
It's recently bought by JP Morgan, which is part of my point. So thank you very much, Mike. Very interesting. You have to scroll right down to the very bottom. I don't know how you came up with that, but right at the very bottom of the screen, it tells you that it's recently been bought by JP Morgan. And so it allows you to calculate how much emissions you're going to be making. If you fly from New York to, let's say, Hawaii, you will be emitting something like, okay, great, here. So whoa.
Don't go to the edge.
Okay. So you can see here that you can calculate your emissions flying from, let's say, JFK to, I don't know, HNL. Is that Honolulu? No.
Honolulu is HLN.
Okay, HNL. All right, great. One passenger, and you can calculate. And you see here that you've generated, or you will be generating 2.28 tons of CO2, and it will cost about $35 to offset. And then you can find out all the sort of nifty offset programs that they have going here. That amount of carbon emissions is roughly the same amount of, roughly twice the amount of carbon emissions in an average African country. And obviously there are many differences between different African countries, but just to give you a sense of how much is involved in what is fairly common leisure travel in the United States. The reason I bring up this specific example is because obviously it's a part of one of the predominant responses today to climate change issues, and that's greenwashing, right, with corporations trying to make profit from these issues, and also because it's connected to some of the international policies which we've heard unpacked in the first two presentations. Basically, the kind of cap and trade system works by allowing corporations that are polluting to buy credits for projects in other parts of the world and offset their pollution. So this is under the Kyoto Protocol. The rationale was that polluters need to have some sort of incentive to buy into the agreement. Of course, once you give people rights, they don't want to really give them back again, so it's often a problem. But the way that they hold on to these ideas is through offsetting projects in places like Africa, where there's very little emissions. And the project I'm involved in right now looks at one of these kinds of chains of offsets, looking specifically at how a Dutch company, which is involved in energy generation. This is a public company, so nationalizing energy companies may not necessarily be the answer, despite what we just heard at the plenary agreement. This is a Dutch energy company which is offsetting its emissions by carbon credits for reforestation projects in Uganda, in a section of Uganda. And this is in a national park. Sounds great, reforest a national park. The problem, of course, is that many of the national parks are connected to the legacy of colonialism. Parks were often established as game preserves for the colonizers, and indigenous people were pushed off land where they had been living. In the case of this project in Uganda, people continued to live there, indigenous people, and the national government came in and pushed them once again out of the parkland, despite their sort of attempt to get back into the territory which had been contested since the era of nationalization, and allowed the creation of trees for offsetting projects. We've already heard from Janet some of the problems with the much larger initiative to commodify forests. This is something that happened before this initiative as part of the Kyoto Protocol. And so what this local movement has done is to sue the Ugandan Wildlife Association, which has been keeping them off the territory. And through links with various different international associations, they've managed to publicize their struggle. Now, obviously, international conservation organizations have not always been on the right side of many of these kinds of struggles. Historically, they've often been on the side of creation of preserves that have encroached on traditional people's territory. So this is very much a kind of battle around what conservation and what environmentalism means. And advocates of climate justice are challenging many of the sort of concepts which circulate in the public sphere around environmentalism and challenging many of the positions of mainstream environmental organizations. And these kind of challenges are going to have to be pushed. Now, the other link, of course, is to communities in Holland that are affected by these carbon offsets, because by offsetting, what happens is that the Dutch energy companies get to keep polluting, right? They don't have to cut their emissions. So there are local communities which are affected by the offsetting schemes, which are beginning to mobilize and to challenge these kinds of practices. The other thing, of course, that's happening is that as sort of Dutch environmental movement ramps up, there's a need to keep finding sources for the power which the energy companies are burning or creating. And of course, these sources tend to continue to be carbon sources, right? Unless there's a huge push, we're going to see more and more carbon being taken out of the soil and burnt, rather than a shift to sustainable technologies. Where does most of the carbon that's being burnt and put into the atmosphere from these Dutch power plants come from? It comes from the United States. Holland is the largest importer of coal from the United States. Where's that coal coming from? It's coming mainly from the Appalachian region. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, the main way in which the carbon is being harvested is through mountaintop removal. So instead of going down and mining and taking out carbon, companies are currently just removing the entire mountaintops and creating a great deal of sludge, which gets put into local rivers and pollutes the water table. So there's a very important movement against mountaintop removal in Appalachia that's mobilizing today. So the question is being able to trace these links and make people aware of the global connections that bind them together across these various different links in the carbon economy, as well as give people a kind of broader sense of how the current marketized approach, which the first two presenters talked about, is highly problematic and not leading to the kind of really serious change we need. And I think that that's what the climate change movement is very much pioneering, making these kinds of links across communities and across different spatial scales, and also giving a broader critique of the market solution to the crisis we face. Okay, thanks so much.
My name is Brooke Lehman. Most of you probably know me from Blue Stockings Bookstore. But for the past year and a half, I've been wearing another hat, which is as part of a project called Yonce, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. I have been told that when I ad-lib, I talk slow. So I hope you forgive me. I want you to know some of this information, so I'm gonna mainly read. So I wanted to thank Michael for having me here today. And I'm here to talk to you about a project called Yonce that puts forth an alternative model for addressing some of the critical aspects of the rapidly growing renewable energy market. The motivation for Yonce stems from the recognition that the transition to green energy has the potential to be profoundly unjust. Control over an energy system based completely on renewable energy sources requires, amongst other things, control over very vast territories. This fact is notoriously absent from most analyses of renewable energy, and so are the myriad implications for rural communities and for power relations and for society as a whole. Rural communities, many of which are indigenous, may have access to lands rich in renewable energy resources, but they most often lack access to the technology, financing, and skills necessary to undertake their own renewable energy projects. This puts them in almost certain risk of losing control over their lands. The Anza Group was established in order to build the financial, technological, and educational resources to enable rural communities to secure democratic control over their own natural resources and to become significant players in the new energy market. Our ultimate goal is to contribute to the construction of a commons-based energy system and to a network of vibrant, self-determining communities. Energy systems don't change very often, and when they do, the power in which that transition happens is often relatively quick. And the new power relations are really defined within that moment. And once these new power relationships are established, they're very difficult to change. And so over the next few years, we have a rare opportunity to collectively give shape to a transformation that's based on a local and global commons. The Anza Group borrows its name from the Yoruban goddess of wind, lightning, and passionate change, and it's been created with this aim in mind. The Yonce Foundation is to be chaired exclusively by leaders of grassroots social movements, particularly from the Global South. Some of the individuals that have agreed to sit on our board include leaders from the Domestic Workers Union in Bolivia, the National Alliance of People's Movements in India, the Indigenous Self-Determination Movement in New Zealand, the Zapatistas, and the indigenous resistance movements in southern Oaxaca. The Anza Group will consist of a nonprofit wind turbine manufacturing company, a global foundation, and an investment fund. I'm going to focus on the foundation's activities because it's really the heart of the project, but I do want to mention the activities of the manufacturing company and the fund. Yonce is the brainchild of anti-capitalists, all of whom played major roles in the anti-globalization movement from Europe to the Zapatista uprisings. So the fact that we're trying to create an anti-capitalist project that requires huge amounts of capital investment is something that is tricky and warrants a lot of careful planning to keep the values of the project solid. And this is something that I'd love to talk about if we have time. The Anza Foundation will work with communities that want to make use of their renewable resources as a means to self-determination. Our initial work will be with large-scale projects that will produce renewable energy for the grid, but we're also looking to participate in off-the-grid projects and other appropriate technologies for community development. The foundation will facilitate community training, favoring direct transfer of knowledge and skills between communities. This training will encompass different activities aimed at empowering the community as a whole, not just its most trained members, which are generally male-gendered, to make collective decisions about the use of its renewable energy resources. Over time, we expect to build up a training network comprised primarily of communities that have already realized projects and are ready to share their knowledge and experience. We expect several of these communities to build dedicated centers for this purpose or to work in cooperation with existing community-based training facilities. If a community decides, after discussion, that they want to build a large-scale project to sell renewable energy to the grid, the Yonce Foundation will finance the project and run it in partnership with the community. The profits from the project will be equally divided between the community and the foundation. The part of the profits going to the foundation will be used to finance further community projects elsewhere, and the part going to the communities will be administered by a community-based, transparent, and democratic structure, following collectively decided priorities in order to ensure that it's devoted to strengthening the community as a whole. Renewable energy projects will therefore will not be an aim in themselves. They'll be part of a broader framework of radical community transformation. The region that Yonce has already begun to collaborate with is in southern Oaxaca, which boasts the second best wind resource in the world. Like most countries, Mexico has no regulations in place to deal with renewable energy. And thus what's transpiring in Oaxaca is a sort of free-for-all land grab. Corrupt government officials, particularly state officials, have been carving up the indigenous territories and selling exclusive wind energy rights to multinationals who then attempt to get contracts signed with individual farmers. This is illegal in many communities because a lot of these lands are still communally held. But aside from the illegality, the deals are, by all accounts, insulting, offering communities 1.5% of the energy profits or less. And when I was down there this summer, we met with a number of the resistance leaders, and they told us that no farmer had been able to get legal counsel around any of these contracts, nor were they even allowed to keep a copy of the contract. So there's no way for them to verify anything. And some of these farmers have already begun sabotaging the transmission lines on their farms.
The specific community that we're beginning to work with is the indigenous community of Ixtepec. And they're a small community, a strong community that has retained their communal land holdings and have resisted the multinationals. And even before we met them, they had already decided that they wanted to do a community project. The shortcoming to the legal protection that surrounds communal land holdings is that they can't use those holdings as collateral for bank loans for wind farms. So that's where Yonce can come in. And as a partner, we would contribute the funding, the wind turbines, the technical training, and the communities would contribute the use of the land. The communities would determine the entirety of the project, but that would be sort of the practical trade. And the profits would be divided equally. And two of the most respected members of the resistance in this region are on the Anza Foundation. So sort of the us-them is, in many cases, more of a we. In addition to the foundation, Yonce is in process of creating both a not-for-profit wind turbine company, which will both be able to raise funds through turbine sales for the foundation and to provide the foundation projects with turbines directly. Yonce will also be setting up one or more investment funds to help raise the initial capital needed to begin our work. These initial investment funds will be making loans to the foundation, which will be insulated from the funds, such that investments in the funds will have no access to or power over the foundation at any time. So as I present here in a room full of anti-capitalists, I'm assuming, the question that I feel begs to be answered is it reasonable for anti-capitalists to attempt to develop an anti-capitalist or even possibly a dual power strategy within a capital-intensive industry? And my answer to this question is yes, not because it's easy or safe, but because it's necessary. If the new energy economy is allowed to continue along the same trajectory that it's operating along today, 5 years from now, we're going to be facing a whole new level of social and ecological injustice, namely the displacement of huge numbers of rural communities and the entrenchment of a whole new energy oligarchy. So while all of us in Yonce have real concerns about the potential for money to corrupt, through carefully designed structures, we believe it's possible, and as I said, necessary, to create principled anti-capitalist alternatives for a community-centered transition to renewable energy. I beat you.
Well done. Very good. How do you spell that?
Y-A-N-S-A.
Y-A-N-A.
Y-A-N-S-A.
And what is the website?
We're in the process of redoing it, so I don't want to tell you. But at the moment, it's Yonce. Our foundation part is
Yeah, hi, my name is Mark Ray Montero, graduate student at NYU and member of the Park Slope Food Cooperative. Thanks, everybody. Great to hear you all. I mean, boy, I guess I wanted to throw out an observation and a question, and then I'll let it roll. In terms of so I guess the final descriptions of the problem and then the solution, one of the solutions that was proposed at the end, remind me of some great programs that are already going in the United States that I think I love to bring up whenever I can. We've got co-op power, cooperative renewable energy community organizing. I guess it's sort of a half business, half NGO, based in Massachusetts that's doing this awesome stuff. And I just read about somebody initiating their own project down in Washington. I got an email from Grist. Here in New York, I know NYPIRG has organized a fuel buyers group, which combines, at least provides certain benefits in terms of the natural gas and heating oil situation, along with at least representation in terms of wind energy. But there's no discount for the wind situation. So it's this kind of interesting situation that doesn't provide these full benefits yet, but has potential. And then there's energy co-op in Pennsylvania that does, I think, provide certain benefits. And then the Park Slope Food Cooperative buys 100% green, and is an open membership organization and an alternative membership organization in terms of, as a food cooperative, it runs on the cooperative model, which is the alternative to the corporate model, and provides a functional organizational basis for business within the developing countries, the developed countries, as we like to say. And it has an open invitation. It's an open membership to anyone. So, great. I mean, and I know the International Cooperative Alliance, to then extend this to the international scope, just had kind of a climate awareness campaign over the last year. But I don't know that they really actively combined it with any practical projects, like the ones I just described, or I don't know that Yonce is kind of the first I've heard of really grassroots renewable energy internationally. But like the Dutch wind cooperative, the very movement, the very origin of modern wind power was in the Dutch, Dutch citizenry and their the cooperative organizations that they founded, which is has its own fascinating aspects in its own right, which I think would make sense for the International Cooperative Alliance. So I don't know what to say in terms of ending this on a question, but if you guys have heard anything about that, or if you have any, anyway, I just wanted to bring that up and thanks.
Thanks for your comment. Any questions?
I could just mention, I think that there are a lot of really powerful models, particularly Denmark was originally a lot of the reason that Denmark is such a pioneer in wind energy is because there was such a strong community component in that. But as wind energy becomes way more competitive, and in Oaxaca it actually, it's incredibly competitive, it's more lucrative than other forms of energy, that relationship is going to be more challenging to actually to get legislation around because it's going to be so corporations to try and allow. So yeah, I think it's really important for all those
of models to try and proliferate now and really gain control over that aspect of the economy.
Well, because I think the cooperative model ultimately is this question of ownership, right? Because the question is, in terms of cost, like, is what is the cost to the buyers and the producers? If we in the civil society anti-capitalist alternative to this movement, we want to promote renewable energy, and so it's something like what Yonce is doing. It seems to be like the cooperative model, by keeping that forefront and remembering that it's ownership of the actual devices, that's actually what keeps us in democratic economic terms. And I think that's the kind of thing. And then part of that is the small wind energy industry, which is another thing that really, like Amsterdam, has begun these projects to allow us to maximize small wind. And here the Institute for Local Self-Reliance also has some programs. So that provides us with this niche with the reality of us as individuals, which is totally ignored in these policy level, corporate-minded kind of discussions. We are individuals and we're communities, and we can buy residential. So, I see that additional.
So, against the wall, a couple questions?
I have a question. Thanks. I have to say I go to a lot of these things, and it's rare to see four people that are sort of poised, passionate, and intelligent at the same time. So I really appreciate it. But I have a sort of more of, political economy question, which is, there's this issue of sort of pushing against market-based solutions or the market. But then there's also this discussion of sort of different ways of acting in the market and seeing sort of who's acting in the market and how they are behaving. And so I'm wondering if, all of you, if you sort of help me a little bit. So what is it seems sort of both anti-market, but also envisioning some sort of new market or a vision for the market. So I'm kind of confused as to what role the market plays in any of your thoughts. I hope that doesn't lose me my card at the
I think one of the big problems, particularly, and we don't really have enough time to go into great detail, but I think one of the big problems from the vantage of climate justice advocacy or climate justice advocates is that sort of square one is that the market doesn't deliver justice, period. Right? So there's no debate. This is econ. This is pre-econ 101, right? The market's don't do justice. So if we are in a context that's profoundly unjust, then so reliance on the market from the beginning is a false start. This is a false solution. So I think there's this tension that you get on the Yonce side of, well, okay, how are we going to battle these markets? Maybe one stage in that battle is from within the markets. But as opposed to utilizing them, I think from the vantage of climate justice activism, there's an idea where we need to foment justice, and that isn't relying openly on markets. It's predominantly relying, at least some of the folks that are pushing this position, on communities that are offering solutions, on network communities, not necessarily some particular small ones, but ones that are global, ones that are broader. So there's this. That's the first conundrum, that the markets don't deliver from the beginning. So I don't know if other people want to.
Well, I would just add that The other huge problem is the idea, the kind of neoliberal idea that markets optimize pollution and human behavior in relation to pollution. But the basic problem is we should just no longer be polluting. We have to stop taking carbon out of the ground and burning it. And all of this kind of talk of markets ignores that fact. It continues to reinforce our current practices. And they're unsustainable.
But I mean, you're engaging in the market for green, in the market for green energy. It sounds like the problem is the market for the sort of negative consequences, the externalities, essentially. I mean, the problem is you have attempt to have a market for justice, like the buying and selling of justice. Like we will essentially, it's like the old process in the Catholic Church of going in and paying to have somebody say rosaries for you in Hail Marys. That's essentially what they're doing, and that's the problem. But you seem to involve, at the same time, there's a market for community-produced wind power that you want to encourage people to buy and use the market. So just
I think there's so as a pragmatist person, I think there's the reality is we live in a market. We live in capitalism, right? So there's a piece of it that's talking about the transition, and a lot of folks are working on the transition. But the reality is, here we are today, and I think of it from the perspective. I just spent some time with some folks from Pune in India who are organized in a waste pickers union, right? And so the reality is they have a particular job because of the waste that everyone produces, because of this market system. They have an income by picking trash and recycling and composting, and they're organizing themselves to do that in a way where they have access to the raw materials. If they're recognized by certain state powers, they can gain workers' rights. They can gain rights to healthcare. Blah blah blah. The reality is, ultimately, they don't want to be trash pickers, right? That's not the most dignified work, but in terms of the work that exists, this is one way to have dignified work, and it's also a climate mitigating strategy. So it ties back into the whole climate justice reality. And then the piece that for them is the critical piece is, well, we don't like capitalism, we're anti-capitalist, but the reality is I need to feed myself and feed my family today, so I'm going to work within this system, but I'm also going to change the way that I can access finance as a way of shifting, making small incremental shifts within the market. That's the reality of today. So I think the reality, I think the answer is just it doesn't mesh, because we're unfortunately not living in the system we want to live in today, and so we're shifting within that. And that's, as a pragmatist, that's kind of where I see people moving right now.
Okay, Mitch, David, Jerome, and maybe we take those three together. So Mitch.
Yeah, I really appreciated all the panelists of the approaches. It's mind-boggling to try and think of what to do with all of this. And I think Brooke presented one track that she's working on that's really filled with potential. See where it goes. Take a step back to when we're talking about the Kyoto protocols. What wasn't mentioned was that Al Gore was sent to Kyoto, and people may not know that, in order to prevent that treaty from going through, as flawed as it was, as weak as it was, to prevent it under Clinton from going through, unless it included the market, all the things we're talking about here, the market mechanisms. Now that the U.S. hasn't signed, so my first question is, now that the U.S. still hasn't signed that treaty, right, or it won't sign the Kyoto Treaty, can the other countries then take back the edited market protocols that were put into it, or is that just beyond the realm of anything possible? Because they were only edited in the expectation that the U.S. was going to sign it. So can they threaten the U.S., saying, well, we're going to just cancel this whole operation unless you sign it? That's the first question. The second was that there's a real operation going on in New York right now, a real movement against the extraction of natural gas from busting up the ground and the rocks and the water tables and the pollution. And that's a real current movement that people are organizing around us, uniting farmers and upstate southern tier of New York and elsewhere. So how will we plug into that with some of the information that you're presenting here? It seems like it's ripe for organizing, and people are organizing. How do we connect these together? So those are my two questions.
So the responses, David, Jerome?
I mean, one of the issues that seems to me you need to look at is the fact that the whole urbanization process in the United States from the 1930s onwards has been based on a very, very high energy consuming design, suburbanization and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's terribly important to inject into here the whole kind of question of the reurbanization of the United States, particularly since the Obama administration is, I think, about to come up with the idea that it's going to go back to a national urban policy, a national urban strategy, which it hasn't had, the national government hasn't had that since the Carter years. So it would seem to me that this is a moment when this issue could be really injected into the public debate big time, because otherwise we're looking at it too much, it seems to me, from the standpoint of new technologies and the technological fixes to it. And it seems to me there are a whole bunch of other issues that really need to be integrated.
Last one?
Yeah, just a quick sort of follow-up on Alex and your question on markets, just because I counted at least 3 different ways. Markets functions oftentimes as a euphemism. I just heard 3 different things that came up there, and I just thought I would list them. One is that the Yonce project, it seems to me, it's working with markets in a particular way, but its real emphasis is on democracy and on democratic mechanisms for securing community-based rights in the process of developing green energy. And a lot of times the climate justice stuff in particular is really struggling against just the collapse of democratic mechanisms, or just the non-existence of them in many cases. So that's one issue about markets that comes up. Another issue is that carbon markets and offsets in particular are a very specific thing that have the kinds of consequences that Ashley was talking about. And those are markets that are just now being developed. And they function in very particular ways, or don't function as maybe. Finally, just to point out is that a lot of what's happening around Copenhagen is really the financialization of climate change as a problem. So tremendous amount of money being poured in. Lots of people sort of jockeying for a position in terms of figuring out where their interest will lie in carbon markets, carbon trade. So, and that financialization, it seems to me, really has to be situated in transformation since the 1990s and 2000s in the American tax markets.
Any responses to those that
Start with the first one, maybe, and thinking about, you're absolutely right. So, Gore the U.S. basically came and changed what was going to be a clean development fund to a clean development mechanism. Flexibility, so that basically meeting emissions reductions targets would be really cheap for industrial or northern countries. So I think it would be really unlikely at this point to see the other folks who have signed on to the Kyoto Protocol say, we're going to do away with that. I mean, at this point, they've redesigned a lot of their economy and figured out how they're going to reach their own emissions reductions, set up on the fact that they can purchase cheap emissions reductions from other countries. So I would be really surprised if we went backwards. In fact, I think we're going to see an expansion of that mechanism to include things like forest offsetting, and there's certainly sectoral offsetting, which means we could change all of China's cement sector and all of India's power sector. So I think we're going to see actually a huge bunch of gathering more and more piece of the economy into that.
Any thoughts on these things?
What about you?
Yeah, well, I guess a couple of things. I mean, to bring together the 2 points about financialization, increased financialization, and what's sort of possible going forward, without the U.S. I think it's sort of, as Janet said, one of the problems is that you're not going to see this sort of pulling back in the sort of near to medium term. I think there is some possibility for a pullback in the sort of medium to not too long term, because one of the things that's going on is that really I'd say that in a sort of alarming way, in a disconcerting way, reality is outstripping the science. The extent of the crisis is really front page news in ways that it has never ever been before. There was a leading story yesterday as I was driving down here, NPR, about problems in carbon accounting. This was top of the hour story. It was unthinkable that you hear that sort of talk. And the point that was being made in the story was really boiled down nicely, was that this bad accounting could have huge implications on reducing emissions. I think those big problems are popping up at the same time as the extent of the crisis is being revealed to be way ahead of schedule. And I think that that's basically a train wreck that's actually happening. It's very likely the case that we'll see no ice in the Arctic before the middle of the century. And Above ice, you get minus 40. On the ocean, 0. That has a huge implication on, what some folks call the desertification of the whole U.S. And Europe and whole other regions. So some of these problems, we're going to see them very, very soon, and that will force the hand on these market solutions that, by the market makers and market participants, don't work fast enough, won't deliver on time. They tell you when you press them. They're fairly actually clear and confident, very much unlike a lot of the sort of, gangrene NGOs, even the Greenpeaces, that sort of, some of the supposed radical ones are sort of caught up in, should we use markets or whatnot? When you talk,
well, Greenpeace said that.
No, I put Greenpeace in it actually. I mean, particularly GPI, and we can talk about this. I mean, and I tell you this as a board member of the Sierra Club, where some will say is maybe more radical than others, more radical than NRDC, more radical than Conservation International. A lot of them, they have the wrong analysis. Devoutly so. A lot of the Greenpeace folks have gone on to boutique trading operations. So there's I think really what we want to pay attention to is market makers, market participants. Because when you hear Citibank telling you that this is a fraud, then you need to turn on your ears. When you hear folks, at banks saying that this is not going to work on time, that's where you have to sort of ring a bell. And they're predicting this, fairly accurately in terms of its ability to move capital in certain ways for certain interests and not really check the problem. And the new science is really saying that this stuff is really rolling out of hand. So.
May I just add one thing to that? In addition to looking forwards, I think it's also important to look backwards. As so often, solutions in the U.S. get imposed on the rest of the world, as you're pointing out, right? And so this whole mechanism of carbon trading comes out of now typical neoliberal analysis. Ronald Coase at the University of Chicago, who was a colleague of Milton Friedman, was behind pollution pricing. A lot of that was incorporated into the EPA's policies starting in the 1970s. And it failed, right? We need to keep that in mind as we look back and kind of excavate this history, that it just doesn't work. It wasn't able to control sulfur dioxide emissions particularly effectively. So the whole idea that we have to kind of wait for something, for some proof in the pudding, is not the only way we can challenge a lot of these ideas.
Can I respond?
Gentle reminder that you should flag it off because there is another workshop coming.
Okay, so maybe one last question here. You had your hand up.
Maybe we could buy some time from them.
Maybe. So last question to Larry here on the wall.
How many of us have seen the story of Stuff, the online video story of Stuff.org? This woman, in a very gifted way, challenges capitalism and consumption in one fell swoop. The idea of socialism, if we can't talk about it here, then we really are doomed, because if we don't own the means of production, how can we begin to dramatically reduce our carbon footprint with the kinds of sources of fuel that have developed under capitalist modes of consumption? And finally, the idea of Calvinism, which suggests that we can build our way out of it, even among the Zapatistas. And of course, Ms. Redman elegantly said that they have to survive. So yes, building windmills is a better option. But if they're feeding wind energy into a grid that's based on coal and nuclear to propel consumption of middle to upper class people in Mexico, is that a solution? Cuba presents a solution, and they show that with organic food. And this is what we have to apply to all levels of power and fuel.
I think that's a good way to end. But Brooke?
I mean, I don't think Cuba is a wonderful example of a thriving, happy community, particularly post-crisis. I think they're struggling. They definitely want to bring wind power there. I mean, they've been working on developing that. I think they want to have more energy than they have right now. And I think most countries in the world would like to have more access to energy than they do. I mean, I think the real key around, I don't think we have any interest in the market, but looking at ways of engaging in the world we have now and keeping our eye on the prize, which is power. And it's, in terms of Yonce, we're looking at creating community power and offering them the resources so that they don't have to keep selling out their lives and selling off their territory, and they can actually revitalize their indigenous community assemblies. And then also, what I didn't mention about Yonce is all of the technology we develop would be open source, and that the idea of a global commons would be to actually create something that gets out of the nonprofit industrial complex and creates its own funding source to not only be able to fund other like big wind turbine projects, but resistance movements and also other smaller scale projects, but doing that as an open source project.
How applies the ideas of Yonce to New York?
Exactly, community gardens.
So given the time, we should end, but two quick points. One is that this conversation is going to continue this evening at Blue Stockings, and Brooke, you want to tell us?
It might repeat.
Well,
There'll be some continuation, but we can go on much longer than an hour, so if people want to come in late.
It'll be
at 8 o'clock tonight at Blue Stockings, 172 Allen Street, and we'll just go from there, probably after drinks.
Okay. And Mitch had a point he wanted.
Yeah, just passing around the sign-in sheet. If people would like to stay in touch on these issues, just stick your email address on it, and we'll share them and send it out. So we can stay in touch.
And the last point.
One last point is that actually, thanks for bringing up the story of stuff. There is right now Annie Leonard is working on a story of carbon trading that will be launched hopefully before Copenhagen, hopefully at the end, middle of November. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and we would love reactions and thoughts around that as well.
Going to be cool?
Story of carbon trading, very exciting, yeah.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.